Hello and welcome to Referendum TV, and today I'm joined by Stewart Hosie, SNP Treasury Spokesman at Westminster and SNP Deputy Leader Candidate. Welcome, Stewart.
Welcome, thank you.
How are you?
I'm very well, actually.
Yeah?
I finally recovered from the referendum and then we're straight into this, so it's great fun.
It's been all go.
It hasn't stopped, that's for sure.
Yeah. So, what differentiates you from Keith and Angela?
Well, let me just say, they're both brilliant candidates. Respect the pair of them, particularly the work they do as ministers. As I think everyone in the SNP and the wider independence movement respects the entire Scottish Government, the work it does on behalf of the Scottish people. But I think what differentiates me is I've been National Secretary of the party, I've been National Organiser of the party, I've chaired the National Assessment Panel, vetting the candidates. I think I've got a better in-depth knowledge of the party and how it works, the changes we can make that would be beneficial, and the things perhaps to leave alone because they're working perfectly well.
That's an interesting point, because you got 65,000 new members at last count, though the click rate in that must be quite substantial. What will those changes in membership, they're good problems to have, but what problems will they pose? Or what challenges will they pose?
It's volume, first of all, and it's also how we make them feel welcome and how we get the best out of all of these members. Remember, they didn't join the SNP to change it, they joined the SNP to be part of it. So there are three things in particular I've suggested. We need to step up training, particularly for organisers and office bearers, so that we can make our new members feel welcome, get the best out of them and maximise the work we do at a local level. Secondly, in terms of policy development, I think we should have regional national assemblies. 65,000 new people, they will bring a wealth of experience. So we need to accommodate that and make sure we can take that experience on board in the policy formulation of the SNP. And thirdly, I think we should increase the size of National Council. It should be something more akin to Spring Conference.
Right.
So that many of these incredibly talented people can make a contribution at a national level. So those three things in particular, I'd like to see done. It would strengthen us locally, regionally, and nationally, but it would allow the good things the party do, because it functions very well, to continue, and I think that's probably the right balance.
Okay, we will come back to that. You're very high profile because you're the party treasury spokesman at Westminster, and Westminster, naturally enough, gets a higher profile in the national news. Do you think that'll have a bearing on people's intentions?
Well, it might, but I think the key thing is we'd all like the focus of Scottish politics to be in Scotland.
Absolutely.
That's what we want it to be. I mean, as every SNP MP ever elected has said, we don't go to London to settle down, we go to settle up.
Right.
And we were so close in the referendum. However, you're right, and because we're in Westminster, we get a slightly higher profile in terms of network news. I've got no idea if that will be an advantage or not. It will be to the party, all 80-odd thousand members, to determine, do we want an MP, someone with that experience? Do we want to focus solely on Holyrood, someone with that experience, say as a minister? That's a decision for the party, and only time will tell.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a good point. I suppose, one of the challenges of you being at Westminster is how you would manage the party from afar.
Well, I think the responsibilities of a minister are huge, absolutely enormous. And I don't think the distance these days is a constraint on what one's able to do. I mean, if it's helping with organisation, if it's bringing ideas, if it's attending NEC meetings, if it's helping with organisation, the challenges in terms of time would be the same for an MP as it would for a busy minister. So I don't think that should be a concern at all. Rather, do people want the experience I bring, or do they want the experience Keith or Angela bring? And again, as I say, time will tell. But the party as a whole.
When will the time tell? When does the vote take place?
Well, the nominations are now closed. The ballot papers will either be issued in paper form or you can do it electronically. And then on the first day of conference, the results will be announced.
When's conference?
A conference is in the second week of November.
So second week of November, and all new members get a vote?
I understand most new members will get a vote on this. That's the plan, as I understand it. And I think it's right. As I say, all of these people have joined to be part of something. it would be a bit remiss if they weren't able to if we fell at the first hurdle, they weren't able to vote for the deputy leader.
So bringing him in is the way forward. Okay, can we just turn to your actual role in Westminster, because a lot of the campaign was fought on areas that directly involved you. If we think specifically the currency issue, and particularly dealings with Mark Carney from the Bank of England, what's your reflections on that process?
I think it was right. I think the policy position to have a formal shared currency union was the best one. Mm-hmm. All the options were there: our own currency, pegged or floating, using the euro, which we ruled out, sticking with sterling in any circumstance. But of course the formal currency union route was the best one, precisely because it provided the certainty and stability that not just Scotland needed, but the rest of the UK as well. Now, those arguments were rehearsed to death during the referendum. We made the point that with 100 billion of exports from Scotland, if they'd been receipted in any other currency, it would have shredded sterling overnight. George Osborne and the Unionist parties knew this. When they said you can't do this, you can't do that, it was just part of the project for your scaremongering. But I think in terms of the position we took and the way we presented it, by and large, it was the right approach and it was the right presentation.
By and large, on the
yeah,
whole.
sure. Listen, everyone makes mistakes. We all make mistakes.
God, I'm glad you acknowledge that. I mean, I certainly do. I make a point of making one at least every show. In terms of what's come out subsequently, your position's been borne out.
Absolutely right. That's absolutely the case. I mean, very quickly after the referendum, the Bank of England announced the contingency planning they had put in place.
Which was?
Well, they were going to cover all the notes in circulation, all of the kind of basic, sensible stuff to make sure there was no run, no panic, and all of the prophecies that the No campaign came up with would not have come to pass. But as you and I know, and as the viewers know, almost nothing George Osborne said was accurate. It was simply scaremongering. It was to try to frighten the Scottish people into voting no by pretending the money would be worthless, there'd be a run on the pound, there'd be a flight of capital. The bank had clearly prepared for all of these eventualities to make sure they didn't occur, and that, of course, was the correct decision.
Nonetheless, the vote was lost by 10%, and there were a lot of businesses, particularly I'm thinking of Standard Life amongst others, who prophesied doom and departure.
Yeah.
What is that your belief that that's how the campaign was lost?
Partly.
Yeah.
Standard Life prophesied doom and gloom in 1979 and 1997 and 2014. And if I understand correctly, the risk register even has concerns about the potential of future devolution, however modest. The same people saying the same things really kicks in the law of diminishing returns. And I think next time, when the Standard Lives of this world say exactly the same thing again, people will remember 2014 and say, oh aye, we've heard this all before.
And they'll see the lovely new headquarters on St Andrew's Square.
Indeed, and I think a lot of that was over the top to the most extraordinary extent. But as to whether that was the reason the referendum was lost, I think Project Fear was profound. The Better Together people say that themselves. They've been boasting privately since the referendum. They put the fear of God in the people. And I think that was a part of it. But on the other side of that equation, we understand perhaps 25% of those who voted no did so to get more powers, substantial more powers, maximum devolution. And again, as we know, the public suggests that's everything apart from defence and foreign affairs. So the real issue here isn't what happened in the last battle.
Yeah.
The issue here is, will Westminster deliver? And will the SNP and the independence movement return enough MPs next year to make sure they deliver?
I hear that as part as a manifesto there, Stuart. I've just finished talking with Stewart Hothersall. I don't know if you know not Stuart, Duncan Hothersall. I don't know if you know who he is.
I'm aware of who he is.
Right, and he's quite confident that the vow will be delivered in full. What's your view?
Well, we don't know what the vow is. I mean, there have been three political parties. Each have their own little plan. They were pulled together in the so-called command paper from Westminster this week. None of the plans amount to the devolution of more than perhaps 30% of Scotland's revenue base, and none of the plans would even fund half of the Scottish Parliament. That is not maximum devolution.
Is that just Calman plus a little bit?
It isn't even plus, it's very thin indeed. I mean, if you think the Prime Minister offered the largest programme of devolved powers ever, or words like that, and Gordon Brown, goodness, he suggested we have the closest thing to a federal state within 1 to 2 years. What's on the table at the moment is neither of these things. Now, unionist politicians, well, certainly ones on the government side, will say this is a floor, not a ceiling. What I'd hoped this week would bring in the House of Commons was the opportunity to debate and find out how high that ceiling is. What is it we can actually get that the Scottish Government would find useful to help benefit the Scottish people? But of course the debate this week in Westminster was hijacked by the English votes.
On Twitter you described it as the old anti-SNP hate fest.
Oh, that was Scottish Questions. That was another one of the great highlights of this week, when the Scottish Secretary is suggesting that before it's really happened that the SNP are not prepared to negotiate in good faith. I find absolutely laughable when it would appear to be the Labour Party.
Is that Alistair Carmichael?
That's Alistair Carmichael.
At the moment,
yeah. And it's the Labour Party who are backtracking on devolution. But to the extent we've got Gordon Brown suggesting that more devolution would threaten the Union. The thing that will threaten the Union is Westminster failing to deliver. They know it, I know it, and the viewers know it.
At what point will you be able to say that?
Oh, I can say it right now.
Right.
What we need to do is negotiate in good faith. The Scottish Government are quite clear. The Smith Commission will not lead to independence. We recognise that.
Yep.
That document also says that our proposals need to be tested. We understand and we respect that. That's the right approach to take. But what we can't have is backsliding from the Westminster parties. They promised maximum devolution. They promised the closest thing to a federal state. They promised this in advance of the referendum. They now have to deliver, and we now need to deliver the largest number of independent supporting MPs ever to hold their feet to the fire to make sure they deliver that.
It's an interesting number of terms you've used there. Independent supporting MPs. That's a slight change.
Well, no, I've been very clear in what I've said in terms of the pitch for Deputy Leader.
Right.
The referendum campaign was magnificent. People from all parties and none came together to fight for Scottish independence.
Yes.
The campaigning effort was extraordinary. To the 18th of September, tens of thousands of Yes activists knocking on the doors of over 1 million identified independent supporters. If we can keep that going next year, we will win. Now, I hope, though, that all of those good people, or many of those good people who came through the Yes movement, will be able to stand next year. That's why I talk about the largest number of independent supporting MPs. But I'm very clear, the SNP is the main vehicle to do this.
Sure.
We stand in Westminster, we can win at Westminster, we know how to deliver. But let's keep this Yes movement alive, because it's that which will deliver, not just in 2015, but in the years after that.
It's an interesting point, because we talk about Scottish Questions and we talk about the devolution debate, which was mainly, what was it?
English votes for English laws, by and large.
EVEL.
EVEL, yes.
Whoever came up with that was a very clever individual.
The best acronym ever.
Yes, absolutely. Certainly in terms of you're a unionist Labour supporter, it would seem an impending evil. If we come to your position when you're down there are 6 of you.
Yeah.
Rattling around that place with 653 others. Is there a sense that the Westminster Parliament doesn't actually know the strength of the independent movement and the SNP?
I think that's absolutely right. And, because in Scotland, the unionist movement, if you like, is mainly what's left of the Labour Party. They were in denial after 2007 when they lost. Not a single seat changed hands in 2010. They lost again in 2011. They lost the council elections in 2012. They lost the European elections this year. We've seen the Yes results in huge swathes of Scotland, not just in Dundee and Glasgow and North Lanarkshire and Western Berkshire. You know, in West Lothian, no one, but we won in Livingston. In Fife, the no campaign won, but we won in huge chunks of central Fife. The Labour Party remain in denial about the strength of demand for real change. That will be their undoing if they carry on the way they're doing.
Well, the blogger we were talking about earlier was suggesting that it wasn't a vote about party politics. It wasn't a vote against the Tories, the independence result.
Well, I think that just tells you everything you need to know about the Labour Party. They think an election next year, or after that, where all of the parties put their pitches forward, is about voting for or against the Tories. The Tories have one seat in Scotland. They're not at the races in Scotland. The Labour Party have misjudged this again. They're back to what they always do, a core vote strategy. That's it. Now, I think when we get to next year, if we can maintain the campaigning effort and enthusiasm of those who want real change, we will deliver independent supporting MPs, SNP MPs, the length and breadth of Scotland.
You think there'll be gains all across the board?
I think if we can keep this together and get it right, we should be trying to make gains across the country.
When you say getting it right, does that mean there's discussion with people from RICS? Does it mean there's discussions from Business for Scotland, Women for Indie? Do you still retain those relationships and talk with these people too?
Those relationships must be maintained. Now, I've been very clear. I am not going to be prescriptive about how this happens, because it's not up to the SNP. It's up to agreement between the SNP and all of these other organisations. And we've got to be incredibly respectful that these are independent organisations with their own identities and in some cases their own policies.
Yes.
And I think we need to respect that. So whether there are people standing on some kind of joint ticket, whether there's some kind of joint manifesto, that is not something I will prescribe or the SNP should prescribe. Yes, Scotland worked because it was organic and we allowed people to keep their own identities. There was no command and control. If we continue to be that respectful and keep that movement together, then we get it right, then we win.
Blair Jenkins, when he was here, he was talking about setting up the basic structure, and then things started to flow from there, and it became more organic. Yeah. Things span out and then span back into the main body.
Yeah. I think that's a really good description, and I saw that there had to be some organisation at the beginning, and then particularly at local level, things were allowed to simply develop and be fluid and be organic, and that was a massive strength. So I could turn up and join in a RIC mass canvass, the Greens could turn up with us and join in a Saturday street stall, local campaign groups could do their own thing and people could come in and out as they're required to. It was a massive strength to the Yes campaign because it allowed people with real experience on the ground in their own communities to actually do the work, understanding what happened on the ground.
I think that's a good point. Can we just turn to the UK level?
Yeah.
It's something that I'm sure you have to do, I certainly have to do, switch between UK level politics and to Scottish level politics and the different structures there. As we approach 2015 and there's this UKIP surge, okay, in the polls at least, and at least one member now, and Ed Miliband doesn't look a particularly strong leader, and all the vagaries that are going on in the background there, how do you think it'll pan out?
Well, if I knew that, I'd probably do the lottery this Saturday.
Well, yeah, I'm not asking you. I'm not saying, Stuart, tell me, because you know.
Ed Miliband doesn't look like a Prime Minister. I think there are many in the Labour Party who don't think Ed Miliband looks like a Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Nigel Farage doesn't look like a Prime Minister either. Now, while his party may tap into what's known as a kind of anti-politic feeling in parts of the country, I suspect if they get more than 1 or 2 MPs next year, they will be doing extremely well indeed. And I think a party which has 1 MP, remember a Tory who simply held his seat, who stood down to cause the by-election, this is not really a massive groundswell of public support.
You had a wee increase.
You get that in a by-election. These things happen.
Okay, fair enough.
But this was 1 MP who effectively held his seat. And I think that UKIP should be treated with the correct level of respect.
Right.
Let's say the same as the Green Party in England and Wales get in terms of media coverage, which is very, very little indeed. I think UKIP are a media construct by and large.
What would the media's interest be in that? Just
I've
it's a
not-
story.
Maybe they find it interesting. Maybe Michael Farage is in, what's his name?
Nigel Farage.
Nigel Farage, there we go. Maybe Nigel Farage is a charming guy. I don't know. I've only met him once, and that was years and years and years ago. I don't quite understand what the fascination is. Remember, in Scotland, this is a party that doesn't have a single councillor.
Yeah.
Doesn't not just run a council, doesn't have a single councillor, doesn't have a single MSP, doesn't have a single MP. I've got no idea why they're given any coverage at all.
But nonetheless, they are, and they're polling towards 18%. Roughly, in terms of the politics of it all, if it does poll at 26 MPs, that potentially gives the SNP some leverage down in Westminster.
Yes, but I won't put a number on how many SNP MPs we might see elected. I think the key thing is to maximise the number we can get, but not setting a target a year in advance. That's just daft. But clearly, the results from the referendum, where Yes did incredibly well, if we can keep that campaigning enthusiasm together, we can deliver a substantial number. And if that gives us the leverage we need to make sure powers are delivered, then that's the right thing to do. Remember, Westminster only understands one thing, which is raw power. It's the number of MPs you have. If the Scottish people want more powers, they have to vote SNP, otherwise Westminster will backslide.
But suppose if the polls are suggesting that Labour could win it, that might convince a few people who voted yes to switch back to their party loyalty. If they were teetering.
Perhaps, but when the turnout was in the mid to high 80s, where 97% of the people actually registered to vote, perhaps 1 million or 1.5 million or more of those people don't have party loyalties. They've rarely, if ever, voted. This is a group of people, many of whom voted for the first time, or certainly the first time, perhaps in decades.
Yeah.
They can't be counted as Labour voters or Tory voters or Liberal voters. These are people who voted for independence, by and large. What we need to do is keep them and get them voting SNP.
It's interesting how people project onto this great unknown and attribute all these different things to them. They're doing this for this reason. The proof of the pudding will be in the vote.
Absolutely right.
In May. If we can come more to the vow and what may happen with the Smith Commission, what level of powers do you think we will realistically get, and then where does that place the battle going forward at Westminster?
The Scottish Government proposal, or submission to Smith, is incredibly detailed. It's not just the powers we think we want, it's why we need them and what we're going to do with them.
Yes.
It's incredibly well put together, but of course this needs to be tested, and our friends and other political parties may have slightly different ideas about this, and that's fine. But we need to get a package of powers, which is not just about some more money with a cut in the Barnett formula, which might well be proposed by Westminster. It's got to be about the powers to make a difference, to grow the economy and be able to benefit from it. But it's about taking responsibility as well, so that we make the political choices to improve the life chances of the Scottish people, which means welfare and job creation needs to be devolved as well. And it's also about Scotland on the world stage. We understand foreign policy will remain a reserved issue with devolution. But if in the EU there are negotiations which impact directly on Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, or one of the devolved administrations, surely to goodness, Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish ministers should either be at the negotiations or frankly leading them if it's that important to that country.
I suppose the unionist members of the Smith Commission, Michael Moore, Tavish Scott, and some others whose names, Professor Tompkins, I think, their goal will be to try and suggest that they're delivering something of substance and yet retain a lot of powers.
Well, I'm going to be slightly more generous at the moment.
Okay.
I mean, remember, Tavish Scott suggested previously that corporation tax should be devolved.
Yes.
before it was ruled out in a later Liberal commission.
Yeah.
Perhaps Tavish Scott will have another look at this and say, yes, corporation tax should be devolved. We've had Labour in the past say all of income tax should be devolved in the interim report, and then concluded that only a little bit of it should be. So perhaps when Greg McClement looks again, he might say, no, if the Scottish Parliament is to be truly responsible, not just having the authority to spend, but the responsibility to set the tax rates and collect it, then perhaps they'll look again. So let's go into this open-minded, not to do as Alistair Carmichael said and negotiate in bad faith. Let's be absolutely open-minded about this. If we can get a package of powers that the Scottish Government can use to benefit the people, brilliant. If, however, having gone in open-minded, wanting to deliver the best for Scotland, and we find we're let down by Westminster, that's a different story.
Let down by Westminster in the delivery,
In the package which is finally announced and delivered.
which would go through Parliament.
It has to go through the Westminster Parliament. Now again, the UK Government are suggesting this will happen. They've said that. So they must ensure it happens, one would have imagined. If it doesn't, it's not just yes voters or SNP supporters are letting down. It's potentially the 25% of no voters who voted no in order to get substantial new powers.
That's a very good point. That's the question I was asked to ask you, which is what is the plans for achieving Indy now? The 55% won't go away. How do you reach out to them?
Well, I think you reach out to them precisely by recognising that the 2015 election is not a rerun of the referendum. It can't be. Nor is the Smith Commission outcome going to be independence. This is about substantial new powers. That's how you reach out to huge numbers of people who voted no, who want those powers. This is what we are campaigning for now. If there's another referendum, if there's some other mechanism for independence, it's not next year, it's not in terms of the Smith Commission. But let Westminster and the Unionist parties be in no doubt, if they let down no voters, everything changes.
Well, that's what Ming Campbell said. I think taking the First Minister's, the still existing First Minister's question, Alex Salmon, point rather, which was holding their feet to the fire.
Absolutely right.
He said it rather awkwardly. He said he would be holding their feet to the fire even more so. What does that mean?
I'm trying to decipher what Ming Campbell might have meant.
Not what Ming meant, but just the general phrase. And how can it be done with six?
You can't do it with six.
Yeah.
You can do it with more.
Right.
And that's the point about delivery of large numbers of independents supporting SNP MPs next year. That raw power, just the arithmetic of a large number of MPs, will focus the attention of Westminster. And of course the knowledge that if they let down no voters, they're in trouble. And of course there are other dynamics at play here.
Yeah.
If there's an in-out referendum proposed on Europe, and it looks like driven by the UKIP tendency of the Tory backbenches to actually pull out of Europe, that changes everything as well. So Westminster needs to be extremely careful and deliver.
The Chinese say it's a curse to live in interesting times, but we certainly do, because the move away from ECHR as well, the European Convention of Human Rights, I was talking to Duncan earlier about that, and he was dead against that.
Yeah.
James Aitken reckons there's not a lawyer in Scotland who would put their hand up to support the withdrawal either. But nonetheless, it's gathering momentum as a proposal.
Well, what's gathering momentum is the kind of tabloid nonsense about, you can't arrest criminals because they know their rights and they're going to go to Europe. No, they're not. And in Scotland, every law is ECHR compliant. That's been since the day one of the Scottish Parliament. I think this is a huge issue potentially, a huge issue, but not ECHR in and of itself, because we would still be compliant, but UK withdrawal, and more importantly, UK withdrawal from Europe as a threat or a reality.
Well, if we look at the polling information, 27, almost 50% of potential voters in the UK general election are pro-parties that want to have the referendum for pulling out of Europe. So it seems kind of inevitable that it's going to happen.
Well, let's wait and see what happens. I suspect the last thing the Tory leadership actually want is to do this, but the pressure from their backbenches some of whom actually sound like UKIP already, will be intense.
Say more of that. What do you mean? They
Well-
sound like UKIP already.
Well-
I have a vision that's people braying behind you.
Well,
in Parliament.
they're braying opposite us normally,
All
but
right.
you just hear some of the language and some of the rhetoric. And the kind of anecdotal story that being pro-European now is almost a deselection matter if you're an MP.
Right.
Now, a lot of that is anecdotal, but that's the impression which is given. That must be incredibly worrying for people who want to be part of Europe and part of the world.
Why do you think that is structurally, in terms of your experience of the UK? You've travelled about a lot. You've worked and lived down in London as well. Why do you think it's come about that this is desire from a large part of the mainly English population to withdraw from Europe?
I genuinely don't know. And I'm struck that on a number of levels, there's a disconnect between the debate in Scotland and the debate in the rest of the UK. In Scotland, on immigration, nothing would be better than to devolve immigration powers, say post-study work visas. So youngsters who've been educated here were able to stay and put those skills and talents to good use. But of course the debate on immigration down south is different, and I understand that. But I've never understood the dynamics of why it's different, given the same economic benefits would accrue in England if people who've studied in England were able to stay and work and contribute to the economy.
I think some ideas are about immigration, non-white immigration penetration in certain of the large cities creates a seedbed for people like UKIP and the BNP to grow. That's some of the ideas. But in terms of Scotland particularly, we have an inverted pyramid as a demographic. We have quite a small number at the bottom supporting a growing number at the top in terms of pensions. So we'd absolutely need more.
Well, that's the way it's normally portrayed, but of course the dependency ratio in Scotland between those in work and those out of work, for whatever reason, is actually better than the UK's. It's lower until around 2030.
So that means we need less.
It means that we do need to take action now to prepare for the future,
Mm-hmm.
but not the huge numbers that were spoken about during the referendum.
24,000 a year was
Now that was the net figure. The difference is only 2,000
Yeah.
a year, but that doesn't have to be 2,000 extra people a year choosing to stay or choosing to come in. That could be the Scottish Government providing the opportunities for 2,000 less Scots to leave. Now, we could have done that with independence.
Yes.
But there's an argument for saying, let's make sure we've got the right powers so we can do that with devolution as well. And then, of course, it does mean, for example, if there was the ability to devolve the welfare or pension system, for example, that we can manage that in an affordable way, and that would be the right thing to do.
When you sit in Westminster and you watch these huge swathes of Tories and the Labour MPs, and they debate what they debate and the priorities that they have, do you notice in yourself a distinction between being a Scottish MP and maybe the English MPs that are around you?
No, I don't think down there you notice a distinction between Scottish and being English. I don't think you do. You notice distinctions on policy areas.
Yes.
Perhaps more social democratic or more conservative. I think that's what you notice rather than Scottish or English. The one thing I do find difficult to distinguish is the policy difference between Labour and the Tory on a number of the key issues.
Such as?
Such as Labour introduced the bedroom tax in the private sector, they're making a song and dance about it in the public sector. That's slightly odd. They seem to want to keep to the Tory spending plans.
This is austerity.
Austerity, absolutely right. And although some of the rhetoric that comes out and might be a little different, when you look at the plans, it's extremely difficult to tell the difference between them. And I think that's one of the things which people in Scotland see. It probably explains, at least in part, the rise in support and membership of the SNP and the other independent supporting parties, because they still actually believe in something that isn't the byproduct of this dreadful Westminster triangulation where Clegg, Miliband and Cameron, could be the same people in charge of each and all those parties from time to time.
But interestingly, Gordon Brown was the first person to stick to, as part of their making themselves more electable under Tony Blair, to stick to the government spending plans, when they took office for the next 2 or 3 years, which I assume was simply what Ed Balls is doing with Miliband, which is committing to the next 2 or 3 years of their spending.
Well, let's wait and see precisely what comes out in terms of the manifesto, but in historic terms, they're absolutely right. New Labour stuck to the Tory spending plans for the first 2 years. I think the Tories argue it was the only 2 years that the UK economy was in surplus in the entire 13 years of Labour government, but that's another matter entirely. I think the mistakes that came after that, running substantial deficits when the country was doing well, and then of course failing to regulate the banking sector properly, and then the crash itself, I think that's the real legacy of New Labour.
I have a wee interest in the regulation of the banking sector. When you say, can you explain a wee bit more what you mean about failing to regulate the banking sector?
Well, if you look at where we were then, 97, particularly when Labour introduced the tripartite regime, to where we are now, we've got stronger capital ratios, we've got tougher leveraging rules, we've got the ring fencing of investment and narrow retail banking, we've got a different supervisory structure. We now have, with the FPC, a body that looks at systemic risk in the entire economy, compared to how loose it was under the tripartite.
The tripartite is what?
Or the tripartite being the Treasury, the FSC and the Bank of England.
Right.
Where there was
confusion over roles, yeah.
No one seemed to know who was responsible for what, which allowed us, of course, to have really low levels of capital, really high leveraging, 125% mortgages and all this kind of stuff, which eventually led to the difficulties we faced.
And as you say, the lack of separation between investment banking and retail banking, which was first alighted upon in the aftermath of the Great Depression.
Indeed, and I think there's a book called It'll Be Different This Time, It's Never Different. The reasons for these crashes are all the same. We always make the same mistakes, and we made the same mistakes last time. Now, I think the regulatory framework we have in place now is much better and much tougher. It's one of the reasons we wanted to share the prudential regulation when we became independent. And I think it's important that we keep our eye on that ball and don't let it slip.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's the complexity of the instruments to a certain extent that are being traded that is very hard to track.
Well, we had that, didn't we? I mean, I think you could have asked almost any member of any board of any bank, can you explain, understand, or price some of these complex derivatives? And none of them could. And I suppose the old-fashioned argument was, if it's too difficult to understand, it's too difficult to sell. Now, that's a bit simplistic, of course it is, but the principle is quite sound. If very few or nobody on a main board even understands the products that were being sold, they were clearly heading for a fall.
It were very complex to follow the cash flows of them. I mean, I used to do that for a living. In terms of the Bank of England was often cited during the campaign as you need a lender of last resort. And we've just been talking about derivative instruments and part of the financial collapse. And I didn't know if you thought you were going to be talking about that. But in actual fact, when you look at the analysis, it was the Federal Reserve that funded a lot of the banks. I mean, for example, RBS was half a billion. Although 535 billion it was. And that, so it kind of renders the Bank of England's role as a lender of last resort.
Not exactly.
Good.
We had the UK support to the Irish banks, we had US support to UK banks, we had the multinational support for European banks, I think the Fortis Bank in particular. So none of this was particularly unusual. These are international banks with an international footprint, essential for business and commerce around the world. So it wasn't a surprise that other jurisdictions helped support the banks nominally headquartered elsewhere. This is perfectly normal. And it was one of the scare stories the No campaign put around, that it was all to do with English taxpayers running to the rescue. It was no such thing for the very reason you suggest.
Yes, and I think that's useful that you can refute that here and now. I'm aware that we've gone to Westminster and I've pursued my own interest in complex derivative instruments, but hey, we've all got other geeky. Let's come back to the situation in Scotland. I'm very fond of Alex for a number of different reasons. How will his resignation affect the direction of the SNP?
I don't think it'll change the fundamental direction at all. The SNP is Scotland's Social Democratic Party. And I think the direction which Nicola will undertake is likely to be broadly the same. I've no doubt about that. Will there be some tinkering? Yes, I'm sure. Will Nicola have some of her own ideas? I'm absolutely certain she will. But no, I don't think Alec stepping down as party leader and First Minister will be significant in terms of the direction of the party changing.
Sorry, we've just got something coming in that I've managed to mess up, so I don't know if you can take it back. I don't know what I've done there. I do apologise for that.
Right.
But it's hot off the press, so we will get it back shortly, hopefully. When they were talking about Alec's resignation in the Holyrood Parliament, it sounded as if it was almost like a gleeful obituary of his political process in some quarters, of his political legacy. What's your thoughts on people believing that he's actually going to withdraw from politics completely?
Well, it'll be for the First Minister to decide what he's going to do with the rest of his career.
Uh-huh.
But as the Facebook picture said, it's showing a picture of some Jedi. If you think I was powerful in politics, just wait till you see me in resignation.
The news that's just come in, this is for immediate release, UKIP's European Parliamentary Group collapses. Have you any thoughts on that?
Oh, good. I think it goes to show this is not a serious political party. They only have significant numbers in Europe where they tap into some anti-politic mood, pulling in Scotland's case, around 3% of the electorate, 10% or 30%, 10% of the vote and a 30% turnout. I'm not surprised that they're collapsing. I think that happened in the last Parliament as well.
Well, the SNP membership tallies about to eclipse the total vote for UKIP in the European elections in Scotland.
There we go. It's interesting you talk about the party membership eclipsing the UKIP vote. Remember that because of the rise in membership, the SNP student wing is now larger than the Liberal Democrats in Scotland. We think the SNP trade union group is now larger than the Labour Party in Scotland. And given half of Labour's membership in the UK is in London, we're approaching the point when the Scottish National Party membership will be bigger than Labour in the UK outside of London. And if those facts don't send a shiver to find a Labour, Liberal or Tory spine to run up, then they should.
What can be done with it? I mean, this is what we keep coming back to. You know, how do we translate that? I say we. How do you translate that? How does Keith or Angela translate that? And Nicola lead that?
You have capacity there, experience, knowledge, a skill base that every other party would give the right arm for. A growth in membership which is fresh and enthusiastic and battle hardened from the referendum, that knows how to campaign. If we use the skills, use the talent, use the experience, use the campaigning wit and will and energy they have, you know, the sky's the limit.
I remember just before the election, the referendum, Colin Fox was sitting there, and he's the only one that mentioned that he'd be quite happy to campaign for another 2 years because he was full of vim and vigour for it. It was the happiest. Yeah. It was the happiest he's been. But you equally seem focused on doing so.
Absolutely right. I mean, you know, we've only got to win once. Now, it's not going to be next year. It's not going to be as part of the Smith Commission. We recognise it. As I said earlier in the interview, there has to be a change in circumstance before we could seek a fresh mandate. Of course there does.
When you mean a change, when you say a change in circumstance, what does that mean?
Well, as I said, if a substantial number of the no people felt let down, that would be a change. It would be no voters demanding more progress. So we need to wait and see exactly the circumstances. But in terms of getting more powers first, getting more powers now, ensuring Westminster delivers now, then the campaign has effectively started. I was in the office last Saturday preparing some work to go down to London with. The phone kept ringing. New members asking when they're campaigning, when they start. I couldn't believe it.
When should they start? I mean, what should? But I guess that again comes down to the deputy leadership role. You've got this. You know, it sounds like a really powerful horse pulling a carriage, and it's going, like, come on, can we get going? And you've got to say, right, well, here's what we're going to do, and here's how we're going to do it.
I believe that our letters and leaflets arrived from the printers today
Right.
The work starts on Monday. That's what we need to do.
You need to be able, you need to be
Absolutely
saying
right,
that to them. Fair enough. I mean, I suppose equally you've got to harness that for the long term,
Yeah.
rather than. And I think that rhetoric around, or not rhetoric, I don't mean to be rude, but the idea around that this isn't going to be a 2016,
Sure.
it's going to be a longer term thing when the circumstances present themselves. But essentially, you've got all this new energy where you can begin to hollow out a lot of the Labour power bases in Scotland. You can begin to...
They've done a good job of that themselves. What we need to do is win the representation in those areas.
At Westminster.
In Westminster. By having better policies, by being committed to the people who live in those communities, by campaigning better and harder and longer and smarter than our political opponents. And the rise in the SNP membership gives us now the ability to do that.
One of the big triumphs of the Yes campaign was the dominance of social media. How would you, as deputy leader, utilise that?
I think the SNP have always been pretty switched on over a number of elections now about the way we use social media.
Well, you've got to say that because you've been heavily involved in SNP organisation.
I genuinely think we have, and that wasn't anything to do with me at all, that stuff.
Okay.
I think we've used it very cleverly.
Right.
But what we have found is the grassroots stuff is even more profound. It's better. It taps into real people and real networks, and we need to continue to do that.
That's the
It's the organic thing as well as the central message.
And that's the chapping on the doors at that stage.
It's partly the chapping on the door or the electronic equivalent,
Uh-huh.
speaking to the people you know on Facebook. Not me issuing a message, whether it's on Twitter or by press release. It's you speaking to your friends, either electronically or when you're at the office, or when you're in the community, or when you're at the bowling club. It's all of the networks, whether they're virtual or whether they're physical, tapping in to communicate properly the benefits of voting SNP, the benefits of more powers, and the benefits of independence.
I suppose one of the key demographics that are thought to have gone against the yes vote is 54-year-olds plus.
Yeah.
How would you shape the party organisation and this mass of new membership to reach out and embrace and engage and then convert?
Well, the key word there is engage. And certainly when I did the hustings in Pollock, one of the suggestions from the floor was, look, we've got a youth section and a student section, a trade union section and a women's section. Why don't we have a senior section? This lady said. So instead of turning up at 7 o'clock at night for the canvassing or the leafleting, why can't me and my team of slightly older ladies, why can't we go to a particular community at 4 o'clock in the afternoon when we can speak to our peers on their own terms? Such a simple suggestion, and why not? So it's all of these things. It's every means of communication and engagement. And I think the lady was absolutely right. And the more of that kind of thing we can do at a branch level, a constituency level, not driven from the centre necessarily, but driven from local communities, because they know where people like themselves live and work and socialise. Let's do the engagement where it makes sense. Whether it's young people or old people, working people, whatever, doesn't matter. But let's use the skills we've got, the experience we've got, and campaign in whatever way is best to get the correct message across.
And one of the policy areas that they were thought to be concerned about was pensions.
Yeah.
And a lot of the fear engendered was around pensions.
Yeah.
Can you maybe speak to that, how that can be, I don't know, how would you say it, how reassurance can be built up around that?
Well, I think we need to start building up the reassurance now. I mean, we all knew pensions would continue to be paid on time and in full.
Who's we?
The Scottish Government and the Yes campaign knew this.
Right.
We knew that with independence we could actually deliver a better pension offering. Absolutely guaranteed, cast iron, affordable, we were going to do this. But that wasn't believed. Instead, there was a lot of stuff being said about pensions stopping, about pensions being cut, just the uncertainty being dripped like poison into the ears of older Scots by the No campaign. We need to be conscious of how they campaigned, this is the No campaign, and start to counter that now, so that at some point in the future, no one will ever believe these scare stories again.
Presumably, there was thinking around this in the Yes Group from 2012 going forward, and in the senior, and in all levels of the SNP. So why couldn't it be countered in the prelude to the vote?
There's a minister in the Scottish Government said to me, he said, I couldn't believe what was being said. I didn't want to believe how low the No campaign was stooping. So we had a positive message, a worked out message, a cogent, clear line on pension delivery and what was going to happen in the future. But some people, including senior people, could not believe the poison that was being dripped in the background by the No campaign to frighten people.
Yeah, I mean that cuts across pensions and other things. I suppose that brings me on to, and we are Broadcasting Scotland, and we're here for a reason, because of perceived bias in the BBC. I think that's why the boss set this organisation up. How do we counter that? How do we counter the mass media and the 36 out of 37 papers not out for no, but certainly not pro-yes either? And how do we counter perceived bias, as demonstrated by Professor Robertson's research? How do we take that on in the BBC?
I'm slightly torn with this. Part of me says the BBC, as a broadcaster, weren't showing overt bias. It was the bias of inertia. This is the way we've always done things. This is the kind of way we've always looked at these issues. The other part of me says, look, we were the ones wanting change, so it was absolutely right that we were given the tough questions. No problem with that at all. We had to explain why we wanted the change. I think what a lot of Yes campaigners felt though was it wasn't the questions, it wasn't even this perception of overt bias by commission, it was more a tone. And trying to challenge that is difficult. It's extremely difficult.
Because it's amorphous, it's a blob.
It's intransigent. It is amorphous. And you can't quite put your finger on. I mean, you can count how many times Alistair Darling was interrupted compared to how many times the Yes person was interrupted. But that doesn't really help you very much. I think it's something more to do with inertia and the fact that it was a large establishment organisation than anything by commission. The newspapers, of course, are different. They are perfectly entitled to have an editorial position. Of course they are. But the criticism that people have of the media isn't that one newspaper might have an editorial position. It's when the news or when opinion turns into news. How many times did you see a front page headline in one paper or another that says, blow for Salmond as Darling issues press release? You're thinking, this is just rubbish, And we still got 45%. We still got 1.6 million votes. And I think as social media increases, as more people have Facebook, as more people have Twitter, as the sadly inevitable decline of some newspapers would appear to continue.
You might be sad, some people might be joyous.
Well, I'm being generous. There's some good journalists out there. Not everyone's bad.
No, absolutely.
And I think this is really important. But as the media appetite changes, then this is what's important. We become the media. We no longer rely on the leader writer in our daily paper to tell us what to think.
Yeah.
Because we can research ourselves. And it did appear to be the case, and you'll know this from the Yes campaign, that when people researched themselves, they tended to vote yes. When they were better informed, on both sides of the equation, they tended to vote yes. And I think what we need to do is become the media, keep explaining why independence is the right thing to do, explain now why more powers are the right thing to do. And so when the scare stories come or the misinformation appears, people can say, I know that's not true, and turn the page to the sport.
I suppose, well, if you wanted to look at the Dundee United's performance, for example.
I'd like to look at Dundee United's performance as often
you're
as possible.
You're a keen fan, I believe.
A very keen fan.
All right, and how do you think they're doing? I mean, from where my team's sitting, they're way up there now.
Well, we're doing very well indeed. I mean, obviously we need to beat Thistle on Saturday and hope Hamilton drop a point or two, and we'll be top of the league again. It's a good place to be.
Well, it's certainly a very nice place to be. Just in terms of football, one of the questions that came in from John Fitzsimmons was, could the surge in SNP membership be even higher without the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, and would they support a review? Now, I noticed before you answered that you're also involved in nil by mouth. Mm-hmm. So just to give it a context, can you maybe answer to that question?
I think what nil by mouth do, first of all, is fantastic. You know, the educational stuff they do around sectarianism is brilliant, and the more of that, the merrier. In terms of the football legislation, or more accurately, the sectarian legislation, I think the Scottish Government are absolutely right. Sectarianism has been for too long a stain on Scottish society. I think the Scottish Government are absolutely right to tackle it, and they have my 100% support.
That's interesting. Perhaps I'll ask you another one. One of the questions was, you know, if you have leadership qualities, which I certainly believe you do, and lots of others do, why did you not challenge Nicola?
Well, I'm an MP.
Right.
I'm not an MSP. The leader of the party will become First Minister. I simply couldn't do that job.
Right.
I have to say I have no ambition to do that job. I remember I've been National Secretary of the party under Alec and John, and National Organiser under John as well. You know, I've seen what requires to be done, and I saw the extraordinary work Alec and John, and then back to Alec, had to do as leader. I am more than delighted to use any modest, humble skills I have as a deputy.
I think it was a cheeky question, but thank you for answering that. Going forward again, as we must, how are you going to bring through talent which maybe begins to eclipse the existing talent?
It's never a problem having lots of talented people. The larger the pool to choose from, whether it's for a council seat, an MP seat, a Holyrood seat, a European Parliament selection, the more talent we've got and the better people we've got, the better representation the Scottish people will get. It is never a problem to have too many good people.
I'm glad to hear that. Just briefly, just as a legacy before we wrap up, corporation tax, would you have that here or not?
Yes.
Yes. Why?
It's all good and well having income tax, but imagine if the Scottish Government felt they were doing quite well, they were confident, let's say they cut income tax by a penny or two, and it boosted economic growth, but it was paid for by a rise in corporation tax. As it stands today, every penny of that would go to George Osborne's treasury. We would take the risk, but we wouldn't get the reward. And of course, the same applies the other way. Imagine if we were able somehow to cut corporation tax to boost job growth, so that 100,000 more Scots were in employment. That'd be great. We don't have the power to do that. If, on the other hand, George Osborne or Danny Alexander changes the North Sea supplementary charge, the corporation tax the North Sea pays, and it damages the industry, there's nothing we can do about it. And that's the whole point about having a balanced package of devolution. We've got to not just take responsibility, not just carry the risks, which the Scottish Government are willing to do, but also reap the rewards when the decisions we take boost the economy so we can do more and better things for the Scottish people.
Absolutely, and thank you for that fulsome and passionate answer. We are now moving towards an end. I've been joined today by Westminster Treasury spokesman for the SNP, Stewart Hosie. I'm very grateful for you taking the time out of your very busy schedule. I know you're heading to the wilds of the Petlands constituency later on today. I wish you well in those hustings. Stewart Hosie, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure, real pleasure. Thank you.